What I want to do, though, in order for us to think these themes through properly, is take something of a step back. Talk, if you like, about why, through historical reasons, we are concerned with what I might call the rise of statute law. Because I think if one looks at simply the volume of statute that is being produced, and one takes a position over the last 100 or the last 50 years, or even the last 20 years, one can see that the business of Parliament in making law has become more and more pronounced. In other words, we're concerned with a historical phenomenon. Now, we could say that this is related, and I think this would explain it, to the way in which Parliament as a lawmaking body superintends or oversees the manifold areas of social, economic and political life. That is why the amount of statute law produced by Parliament has increased so markedly over, let's say, the last century or indeed the last half century. This, I think, has been an important theme in the recent history of British law. Well, recent in British terms is always begs a question of history, and this indeed may take us back about 300 or 400 years, but that's a minor digression. Let me make the point that I want to make. What I'm concerned with here is a justification for statute law, for Acts of Parliament, a way of thinking about them historically, and a way of thinking about them perhaps more thematically, or dare we say philosophically, as to how we can conceive of their operation within the English legal system. Now, I'm saying the English legal system, more correctly the English legal system of England and Wales would be perhaps better to say, better to describe the relationships that we're talking about. Certainly if one is a Scottish nationalist, a Welsh nationalist, or even an Irish nationalist, one would object to the idea of an English constitution. One would possibly, conceivably, also object to the idea of a British constitution. Given that one of the arguments that is current in the United Kingdom is the devolution of Scotland, then we are thinking about these ideas in quite a politically fraught time. Obviously, the recent history of the United Kingdom is a history of people objecting to the colonial hegemony of England vis-à-vis Ireland or indeed Wales. And so I don't think one can really strip the politics out of this subject, and one has to be a little bit careful whether one is referring to the British Constitution or the English Constitution. I'll clarify those points if and when necessary. It's more of a kind of general caveat or warning. So what I really want to do is pick up on the point about how we can explain and understand the rise of statute law and this concept of sovereignty. And I want to take you back to perhaps one of the most important political texts written in England in the early modern periods, Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan. Because Leviathan, which was written in the late 1600s, engages with the defence of an idea of sovereignty. Now, very crudely, the idea is that for the maintenance of peace in a political community, we need a single source of power that makes law. And so one can see how Hobbes's concept of the Leviathan, which really reflects historically the aftermath of the English Civil War and Hobbes's desire for civil peace, becomes thought of becomes a more general idea that allows us to think about, defend and justify the sovereignty of Parliament. Certainly later important English writers on ideas of sovereignty, such as Jeremy Bentham and John Austin, who were writing in the mid to late-ish 1800s around these issues, were very much into the idea that what lies behind a legal system is this single source of power, the single source of sovereign power, which, as we're saying in our analysis, is linked up with the idea of Parliament. But we need to pause here and think about another interesting theme. We can't really talk about a major or a general franchise in the United Kingdom until about 1928. Why do I say this? Well, it's a question of who can vote. Certainly if we think of this question purely from the viewpoint of women winning the vote, we couldn't talk of women winning the vote until really about 1928, 1918 arguably, but 1928 women are largely voting in the United Kingdom on the same terms as men. If we go back in time, certainly to the early 1800s, we can see that the right to vote is linked to the ownership of property. If you didn't own property, crudely, you didn't have the right to vote. So what happens, and what's so interesting in this period that we are thinking about, is that through various political struggles people enfranchise themselves. Now, I know these terms are rather crude, but we could say essentially the working class and women. The general franchise then, by about 1928, includes more or less everybody, not just property holders, not just men. In other words, the notion of parliamentary sovereignty as the overwhelming political and legal power that governs a community, that preserves social peace, political peace, only really becomes linked to a democratic idea which justifies it around, well, the 1930s, let's say. That's when we can speak of the franchise, the right to vote, in a sense that we would really properly understand it today. In other words, the justification for the sovereignty of Parliament doesn't arrive until much later on. And as I said right at the beginning, it's almost as if we're not careful. The idea of the sovereignty of Parliament seems tyrannical. What restraints are there on a Parliament that has supreme power? That's a very pressing question, a question that I will return to. The fundamental justification is that, well, the people put it there. The people can vote Parliament, can vote the controlling party, the controlling political party, out of Parliament in a general election. As I say, that's a very general kind of guideline. So we need to think a little bit more about this idea of how parliamentary sovereignty is justified. But I want to leave that issue a little bit on the back burner for a moment, because I want to return to the theme that I mentioned a little bit earlier on. And that theme is how we can think perhaps not so much historically, but more in legal terms about what we're talking about or thinking about when we think about parliamentary sovereignty. And in doing this, I want to make use of some ideas drawn from the work of H.L.A. Hart, Herbert Lionel Alphonsus Hart, who in The Concept of Law, which is a major text in English jurisprudence or political philosophy, talks about a way in which, or uses a general idea, which I think is useful to us because it goes a long way to helping us think about what the sovereignty of Parliament, or how the sovereignty of Parliament can be understood. Now, Hart's idea in The Concept of Law is that what lies behind a legal system is a rule of recognition. In other words, a rule that allows us to say, here are the rules of the legal system, as opposed to any other system, social system, economic system, that also makes use of rules. Now, what allows us to say, here are the rules of the English or the British legal system? According to Hart's interpretation of these matters, it's the idea of the Crown in Parliament, or in other words, parliamentary sovereignty. Now that matches up, doesn't it? This idea that the rule of recognition that allows us to identify the rules of the legal system and also point at the major lawmaking power, the supreme lawmaking power in a constitution, relates to the notion, Hart's notion, of the rule of recognition. The rule of recognition allows us to say, here are the rules of the legal system, and here is the fundamental rule of the legal system itself. In other words, the rule that relates to the ultimate lawmaking power in a state. For the UK Constitution, that is the idea of the Crown in Parliament. Let me just explain that notion for a moment. Why are we saying the Crown in Parliament? Well, as with all things in English law, in British law, this is a historical matter. Obviously, Parliament has supreme lawmaking power, so that would explain why I'm referring to Parliament, but why the Crown in Parliament? Well, if you look at the way in which a bill becomes an act, in other words, the way in which law is made, one will see that formally the process is only completed when the Crown, the monarch, effectively signs off that bill, turns it into an act, if you like. That's what formally makes the bill become an act, become something that can change the law, that's something that has the force of law. This is largely a historical, this can be explained, I think, in a historical way, in that it's one way in which the constitutional compromise gives the Crown a kind of symbolic role in government. There's only one example, and it's a very old one, of the Crown refusing to, if you like, sign off on a bill, in other words, to turn a bill into an act. So the idea that the Crown has, if you like, real effective power here, I don't think is an issue. The question really is a symbolic or a, dare we say, ceremonial role. But to return to what I was saying about about Hart, the fundamental idea that we have here is that the supreme lawmaking power that lies behind, that explains why acts of Parliament are supreme is the idea that that power, that sovereign power, lies with the Crown in Parliament. This is the rule of recognition. In Hart's terms, it lies behind the structure of the legal system itself. It lies behind the Constitution. So I might use this idea of the rule of recognition a little bit later on, and certainly if one reads into this subject and if one looks at some of the important precedent cases, one will see that senior members of the judiciary are also making use of this language. So it seems important to me that we are familiar with the concept of the rule of recognition and can understand it as a way of describing parliamentary sovereignty, or the fact that lawmaking power rests with Parliament.